Richard Stengel, you had not known Nelson Mandela before taking on the writing of his book. It must have been a slightly weird experience to be suddenly interacting one-on-one with such a globally famous figure, such as on your early morning walks on the South African veldt.
Yes, it's awesome and intimidating meeting Nelson Mandela for the first time. I mean, he's a magnificent man, or he was a magnificent man. He's tall, broad-shouldered, enormous head, very sunny disposition, a breathtaking smile. And of course, he's very, very gracious, too. He's a Victorian. I mean, he's a kind of a Victorian gentleman in South Africa. And he was a little taken aback when he first met me because I was young, 36 then, an American. He didn't actually know that much about America. And he was a little reserved, I think, in the beginning. But we managed to break the ice. He has a lovely, dry sense of humor. He appreciates competence, which I tried to demonstrate. Very soon thereafter, as you mentioned, he invited me to go down to the Transkei with him, which is the area of South Africa where he grew up and was born, and pretty remote area. And we would, when we were down there, take these early morning walks, and I mean early, 4:30, 5 a.m. for several hours, and we got to know each other well.
How did it feel to go back to those tapes 30 years later for your podcast? Had your image of him changed very much?
So I'm much closer to the age he was then. He was then 72. I'm 67. But I did hear something a little bit different in his voice. I heard a sort of wistfulness that I didn't hear before.
How do you yourself deal with the idea that your wife, you're sentenced to life in prison? You're gone for many, many years. She has a life outside. She meets other men. It must be very difficult to think about that.
Well, that was a question, which one had to wipe out of his mind. Mm-hmm. You must remember, I was underground for almost 2 years before I went to jail.
We did some of the interviews at his house in Houghton, which was a kind of a McMansion in those days and had nothing personal in it, and just his cook was living there. He was lonely. I mean, he had spent 27 years in prison next to people all day long, day and night, and suddenly he was by himself, which I suppose after being in prison he might have relished. But he was someone who liked being around people. He was kind of a natural extrovert. I think he got energy from other people. So I think he was a little bit lonely.
You paint a picture of a very meticulous and disciplined man, incredibly neat. He always spelt out the names of people and places he spoke of in your taped interviews. I couldn't help wondering how much of that was his nature and how much may have been a reflection of 27 years in jail.
He had an enormous gift in his DNA. But then that was refined by the 27 years in prison. The prison acted as a kind of crucible that melted away any impurities in his character. He talks about what he was like before he went into prison, which we don't remember. I mean, he was a tempestuous, passionate advocate of freedom for his people. He was a boxer. All of those things kind of melted away by the time we saw him in 1990 when he came out of prison. And part of that was this incredible self-discipline that was necessary in prison. I mean, the only thing you could control in prison was your own mind, your own thoughts. And Mandela became the master of himself.
The image that most people remember of Nelson Mandela would be as a sort of benevolent grandfatherly figure, as you put it. But of course, for years, he was portrayed in the West as a violent terrorist. How do you reconcile those conflicting images?
Well, I mean, it's a conflicting image because in some ways we have this kind of romantic view of Mandela, and we remember this kindly, grandfatherly, white-haired figure. I mean, one of the things that we try to do in this Audible original, Mandela: The Lost Tapes, is to recall that Nelson Mandela was the founder of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC. And was he a natural militant? Was he a natural soldier? No, he hated violence. He loathed violence. He was an incredibly peaceful, gentle person. But to achieve freedom for his people, he realized that was the only route at that time.
When you undertook this project, you said that one of the things that fascinated you was what was it that made a person great? Did you find an answer to that question in your dealings with Nelson Mandela?
You know, it's a hard question to answer, and of course he is great, and I was a young man, and the opportunity to work with someone and tell the story of a man who was truly great was an opportunity I couldn't refuse. I mean, part of what made him great, I would say, is this incredible focus on a moral goal, democracy and freedom for his people in the face of incredible oppression. He never lost that focus.
Through peace, you will be able to convert, I say, the most determined people, the most committed to the question of violence. And that is the method we should follow.
Also, you know, we talk historically about great men and women, about the man or the woman in the mask, and what's that person really like behind the mask. I mean, what I found with Nelson Mandela was that the man and the mask were the same. To me, that is a form of greatness. Not that all great people have that, but that was something that was in some ways unique about him and inspiring.
Richard Stengel, thanks so much for talking to us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.